Okay, so we're going to dive into all this research on unconscious bias today. It's a pretty hot topic, and to be honest, when I first saw all these articles you sent over, I kind of felt overwhelmed. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down. I've got an expert here to help us sort through it all, pull out the key insights, and let me tell you, some of this research really flips the script on how we think our minds work.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, we often think of our conscious mind as the one calling the shots, but it's much more complicated than that. Research shows that the unconscious mind actually plays a much bigger role in our thoughts and feelings and actions than we used to think.
So it's not just like breathing and reflexes, right? What's our unconscious mind really doing behind the scenes?
Well, for one thing, it's handling a lot of our emotional responses. It's also involved in going after goals. And get this, studies suggest it's even making decisions before we're consciously aware of them.
Wait, decisions, like choosing what to have for lunch or what to wear, or are we talking about big life decisions?
Both, actually. There's this really interesting study where researchers use brain imaging to predict what decisions participants would make, up to 7 seconds before they were consciously aware of making them.
7 seconds, that's wild, but also kind of freaky. If our brains are already making choices before we even know it, what does that say about free will?
That's a huge question. It's something philosophers and neuroscientists are still debating. But we know for sure this research has big implications for how we understand decision-making. It challenges the traditional idea that our conscious mind is the only thing driving our choices.
So if our unconscious is so powerful, how does that connect to unconscious bias? I know that's a big part of your work.
It's all linked. These unconscious processes, as complex as they are, can also lead to some unintended results. Unconscious biases are basically hidden prejudices we all have, often without realizing it, and they can influence our judgments and actions.
So even if we think we're being totally fair and objective, our unconscious could be pulling the strings in the background.
Exactly. And the thing is, these biases are incredibly common. You sent over an article that reviewed 81 studies on unconscious bias among healthcare professionals. 70 of those studies, that's over 86%, found some kind of bias against minorities.
Whoa, 86% is a huge number. It really shows how widespread this problem is, especially in a field like healthcare where those biases could have a real impact on how patients are treated. What are the consequences we're talking about here?
Well, think about it. If a doctor has an unconscious bias against a certain group, it might unconsciously affect the treatments they recommend, which can lead to unequal care. That article also mentioned that when they used implicit measures, which are tools that test for unconscious bias, the numbers were even higher. 54 out of 56 studies found evidence of unconscious bias. That's almost 96%.
So it's not just a few bad apples, it's a systemic issue built into a lot of institutions. We've got to do something about this, right?
Absolutely. And there's been a lot of talk about unconscious bias training, or UBT, as a possible solution.
Great. I remember seeing some articles about that in the pile. What's the verdict on UBT? Is it the magic solution everyone's hoping for?
Well, the research on UBT is mixed. There's evidence it can raise awareness about bias. And some studies even show that it can weaken implicit bias in the short term.
But what? There's always a but, isn't there?
Well, the evidence for changing behavior long-term and making a difference in the real world is much weaker. Some studies have even shown a backfire effect, where UBT actually made bias worse.
Made it worse. That's scary. Do you have an example from the research?
Yeah, one study you sent showed that exposing clinical residents to schizophrenic patients actually increased their implicit association of illness with criminality.
Wow. Okay, so maybe just raising awareness isn't enough. If UBT isn't the answer, what can we do to make lasting change?
That's where we need to be more strategic. UBT shouldn't be the only solution. It needs to be part of a bigger, more complete effort to address unconscious bias. It needs to be woven into a broader diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy.
So we're talking about like a more well-rounded approach, not just a quick fix.
Yeah, exactly. It means thinking beyond those one-time trainings and focusing on really building a culture that values diversity, equity, inclusion. We need to create actual systems and structures that promote fairness and make it harder for bias to sneak in.
Okay, I get the idea, but I'm still having trouble picturing what that actually looks like. What are some examples of these systems and structures?
Okay, well, take hiring, for example. Instead of just relying on gut feelings, organizations could use structured interview processes with, like, standardized questions and scoring. That helps minimize the impact of subjective judgments, which we know can be clouded by bias.
That makes sense. So like taking the human element out of it as much as possible. Are there other examples like that?
Tons. Blind auditions are another good one. They've been used successfully in orchestras for ages by taking out any identifying information from applications like gender and ethnicity. Organizations can make sure candidates are judged just on their skills.
I like that. It levels the playing field, forces people to focus on actual skills and experience instead of irrelevant things.
Exactly. And when you're talking about decision-making panels, like hiring committees or grant review boards, diversity is super important. Having a panel that reflects a range of backgrounds and perspectives can help to challenge individual biases and make sure the outcome is more fair.
So it's about building in those checks and balances at every step, not assuming that anyone is intentionally biased, but recognizing that we all have blind spots and creating systems that help us get past them.
Precisely. That's where the real change happens. It's not about being perfectly objective, which is impossible. It's about being mindful, intentional, and always trying to do better.
But with all this talk about systems and structures, doesn't that make unconscious bias feel kind of impersonal? What about individual responsibility?
Individual responsibility is still crucial. We can't just rely on organizations to fix everything. We each have a role to play in becoming more aware of our own biases and taking steps to minimize their influence.
So besides going to a UBT session, what can individuals actually do? What are some things we can all do in our daily lives?
A great place to start is by really paying attention to your gut reactions, those split-second judgments and assumptions that pop into your head before you even have time to think. Those are often driven by unconscious bias.
Like when you meet someone new and you instantly form an opinion about them based on how they look or talk.
Exactly. And it's not just about first impressions. These biases can affect how we understand information, how we evaluate someone's work, even how we use resources. Once you start paying attention to those gut reactions, you'll be amazed how often bias creeps in.
Okay, so step one is noticing those knee-jerk reactions and recognizing that they might be biased. But with them, do we just try to ignore those feelings?
It's not about ignoring them, it's about questioning them. Ask yourself, why am I reacting this way? What assumptions am I making? Is there another way to look at this situation? That kind of self-reflection can help you break down those automatic responses and make more conscious decisions.
That sounds really helpful. But let's be real, sometimes we're under pressure, we're tired, we don't have time to overthink every little thing. Are there any strategies for those times when we need to make a quick decision?
Definitely. One really powerful technique is perspective taking. Remember that study you sent over about imagining the perspective of someone from a marginalized group and how that actually reduced bias? Stepping into someone else's shoes, even if it's just in your mind, can make a real difference.
Right. It was an empathy-inducing perspective-taking training, and they saw a 55% reduction in bias when it came to pain treatment compared to the control group. So how do we actually do that?
The idea is to get outside of your own head and try to see things from someone else's point of view. Imagine you're in their shoes, experiencing the world as they do. This can help you question your assumptions, get a better understanding, and make more informed decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. If you can take a step back and see things from multiple angles, it's got to help you make a more balanced choice. It also sounds like something you can get better at with practice.
Exactly. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. It can actually change your brain to be more empathetic and less prone to bias. But remember, it's not a one-time thing. You need to make it a habit, a conscious effort to get outside of your own bubble and consider other viewpoints.
We've been talking a lot about practical strategies for recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. But I'm curious about the bigger picture. What kind of impact can all this individual and organizational effort have on society as a whole?
That's where things get really exciting. If we can successfully use these strategies on a large scale, in our workplaces, communities, institutions, we could start to break down the systemic barriers that create inequality.
So we're not just talking about changing ourselves, we're talking about changing the whole system.
Exactly. It's about getting rid of those deep-seated biases that have always put certain groups at a disadvantage, creating a truly level playing field. And it's not just about fairness, it's about helping our whole society reach its full potential. When everyone feels valued and respected, we get a wider range of ideas and talents.
That's a good point. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's about making things better for everyone. But let's face it, this is a tough issue. It's going to take time and work to make real progress. It can feel kind of overwhelming.
It definitely can. But even small changes can have an impact. It starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own biases and committing to constantly learning and growing.
So for those of us listening who are feeling inspired to do more, where do we go from here? What can we actually do?
Well, in addition to those individual strategies we've talked about, like perspective taking and questioning your gut reactions, I'd really encourage you to seek out different perspectives. Read books, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts that expose you to different viewpoints and experiences, talk to people from different backgrounds, and really listen to understand, not just to respond.
That's great advice. It's about getting outside our comfort zones and being open to new ways of thinking.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. When you catch yourself judging someone or a situation, stop and ask yourself, why am I thinking this way? Where is this coming from?
So self-awareness, education, and being willing to challenge our own beliefs are key. But what about making change on a bigger scale?
That's where advocacy comes in. Support organizations that are fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Speak up when you see bias and discrimination. Vote for policies that create a more just and fair society.
It sounds like we all have a part to play, whether it's working on ourselves, educating others, or advocating for change.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to make the world a more inclusive place.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. We've learned a lot about the power of the unconscious, how common bias is, and how important it is to take action.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
And to everyone listening, I hope this has given you some new insights and inspired you to keep learning about this important topic. Remember, change starts with awareness. By recognizing the power of the unconscious and committing to growing and learning, we can create a world where everyone has a fair chance to thrive. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.